All right. Good morning. Welcome everybody to the Building Lightning Components Deep Dive session. So our goal on today's session is to talk about more complex stuff on the Lightning Components development process. So if you guys are not very familiar with Lightning Components development so far, I highly recommend a workshop at 1:15 here on the Alpine workshop, getting started. So let's go right into it. So my name is Rodrigo Ribucas. I'm a senior ISV technical evangelist at Salesforce. This is my Twitter, @ROREB. Before we start, Salesforce is a publicly traded company, and we may talk on today's session about things that are not yet available on the platform. So please make all your purchasing decisions based on currently and public available functionality only. As far as the agenda, we're going to start talking about Lightning events. So all the different types of events that are available for you guys to leverage, to fire, to handle on your custom Lightning components, to accomplish communication, basically integration between your Lightning components, and navigation as well. Then we're going to talk about these awesome new Lightning-based components, which are the building blocks with CSS and JavaScript baked in that Salesforce is making more and more available with each release. So they really help with your speed of development and time to market. And then we're going to talk about Lightning Data Service, which is a very cool addition to the Lightning framework. It's a record cache functionality and a standard controller for Lightning component. For those of you that come from the Visualforce world, that basically helps you create Lightning components that have data bound and perform CRUD operations without writing a single line of Apex and a SOQL query. And finally, we're going to talk about a technique that's really handy whenever you need your Lightning components to be more flexible, which is how to create child components basically inside a parent componently, dynamically from JavaScript code. So let's go right into it. Let's do a quick recap of the Lightning Components framework, right? So Lightning Components are these loosely coupled applications that are together, mixed together on a Lightning page or on Salesforce One or on communities, right? So this changes the way of development if you're used to Visualforce, because you used to own the entire page. But now you own these small applications that somehow work together. And this is awesome because it really allows, so it's really loosely coupled, and it allows for a plug-and-play development approach, meaning that you and your customers, you guys get a lot of flexibility and freedom to mix and match the Lightning components that you guys develop with Lightning components from other developers, with Lightning components from the App Exchange that maybe your admins install in the org, right? So you see how valuable this is, because your customers and you guys can create highly flexible applications that really make sense to your customers without having to recreate pages for different customers just to rearrange things, right? And so this brings us to the first topic of our session, which is, so how does communication work between these Lightning components, right? Somehow they need to talk, right? Because people build applications with all these loosely coupled app modules. So the answer is communication on the Lightning framework happens through the use of Lightning events, which you guys can use to share data and communicate between Lightning components, the ones that you build and the ones that other developers build. And you can also use events to respond to interface events from the Lightning framework. You can also use events to navigate the user to different places on Salesforce One and Lightning Experience, and we're going to show you guys some examples of that. So when we talk about Lightning events, it can be a little confusing because there are actually 5 types of events. None of them are particular to the Lightning framework. So we have browser events, system events, navigation events, component events, and application events. And to take a look on today's session, we're going to use a Lightning component that the ISV technical enablement team created. It's part of our recruitment application that we use for demos, and it's a ListView component. So a ListView, this is a custom Lightning component. We have a parent component, which is our ListView.cmp. That's what you guys see on the screen here. And inside this parent, we create children Lightning components, which are ListViewRow.cmp components, right? So let me show you how it looks after it renders. It just looks something like this, okay? I really want to show you guys the code behind this. So this is our recruitment application that I mentioned, and this here is the ListView component that I'm talking about. So notice that we added them to a Lightning page here. So it also has other Lightning components for a specific use case. Let me show you guys real quick the markup for this Lightning component. So the way that we use to add those child list rows on our parent, it's not something very complex. We use RI iteration. I believe most of you guys must know about this. We basically use this component to iterate through a list of records that we gather from the Salesforce org, and then we create our children Lightning components list view rows with different attributes inside our parent, right? So this is the standard approach. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because I'm going to show you another approach later on in the presentation. All right, so let's go back to our deck. And let's talk about the first type of all of those 5 events, right, from the framework. This is, again, browser events are not particular to the Lightning framework. They are basically browser notifications that are fired whenever a user interacts with an element, basically with an HTML element. So on the Lightning framework, here's an example. This is a table header, right? So this on-click event would be a browser event that if you want to tie it inside a Lightning component to an action on your JavaScript controller, you just need to put c.sortGrid in our case here is the action that we're firing inside our Lightning component, that we're executing inside our Lightning component controller whenever the user clicks on a table header row to sort the list. Okay? So nothing too much complex with browser events. You guys must be familiar. Let's now talk about system events. So system events, they're fired by the Lightning framework during the Lightning component's lifecycle, right? So there are different states that are during the lifecycle of a Lightning component. And each of those states are important because you guys can do all sorts of different things, interesting things in code to refresh the user interface on each of those states. So here, if you see here on the monitor, is an example of all the system events. These 3 system events are fired by the framework in this particular order whenever a Lightning component is initially created. So the init, the render, and the after render. So you guys can add handlers to each of these events and do all sorts of different things from code, right? So some examples are the init event, which is it's on all our training material, how to handle this init event with doing it. But the one that I want to show you guys is done rendering, which is another one which was not on the list, but it's on in our code. First, let me show you how you find all the system events that are available for you to handle, right? So if you go to the Lightning Components Developers Guide, and if you search for system event, you get to this page here that has all the different system events that you guys can handle with some good explanation of what they mean. So in our case, in our ListView, we're going to show you that we're using this done rendering system event, which indicates that basically our Lightning component finished rendering, right? And let's see how and why we're using that in our code. So basically, if you go to another tab here, I isolated that ListView component into one page. And notice that, so we had a task, right, from our customer. He said, oh, by the way, when you load your ListView, the first record should be selected by default. So how do we do that, right? So we handle that done rendering system event to make this first row selected. Let me show you the code. So here is our ListView parent component. And here at the very top, we added a handler to that done rendering event that we just saw the documentation page, right? Whenever the done render event is handled by our Lightning component, we're going to execute this done rendering JavaScript action on our local JavaScript controller. Let's take a look at what that does. So done rendering, it's right here. All right, so basically, inside done rendering, we're using JavaScript and component.find to find inside our parent's HTML DOM that first child, that first node by its RID, basically row 0, right? And then we're using that technique to dynamically add a CSS class to that particular HTML component. This is a Salesforce Lightning Design System CSS class that basically makes a table row look selected, right? That's why it turns out to blue, that first row. So basically, that's an example of system event that we handle. Now let's talk about navigation events. So navigation events, they basically enable components interaction with the Lightning Experience and Salesforce One. So if you guys use Lightning Experience and Salesforce One, you probably fire this event, or our system fires these events, and you guys are not even aware that what's behind the scenes. But the good news is that you guys can also leverage these events from your own custom Lightning Components code. So an example would be the force navigate to URL or force create record. If you take a look here at the monitor, the user clicks on that new button, and this standard modal pop-up where the user can create a new record shows up, right? That's standard Lightning Experience functionality, this modal pop-up. But by firing that force create record event, we're able to launch that model on our custom Lightning components as well. So let's take a look how we do that real quick. So here, let's go back to our parents component markup, and let's find that new button that we just saw. So here it is. So basically, whenever the user clicks on new, first we handle that browser event on click, right? Then we take the user, we execute this create new record JavaScript action in our local controller. Let's take a quick look at that. Create new action. OK, create new record. So basically, what we do is, in JavaScript, we instantiate a variable. And then with a.get, we basically instantiate that variable with the e.forceCreateRecord navigation event that is going to create that modal pop-up. We then set the parameters with the object API name of the object that we want the user to create a record, right? So you guys may be asking yourself, so how do I know all the navigation events that are available, right, for me to use on my components? So my recommendation is, if you go to your developer orgs and you open, after the force.com part of the URL, if you open this application, so just put /docs #reference. This /docs application opens up on your developer org, showing all the different events, components, standard events, and actually the ones that you created as well. They show up here on this left pane, and you can take a look at which events, for example, we can use, right? So if you guys look at the force namespace, this namespace holds most of the navigation events. So that create record event is actually here. And if I click on that, I'm able to see the documentation page for that create record event. And if you guys take a look at it, so that event fired to show the full record create panel, right? So that sounds exactly my use case. And here at the bottom, you see the different attributes that we can set, or that we need to set, whenever we fire that event from our Lightning components. So it looks like the only required one is the entity API name, which again is the API name of the object that we want the user to create a record using that standard pop-up. Okay? Let's go back to our code. So we basically fire that event after setting the parameters, and then magic happens, right? That modal pop-up shows up to the user. So it's pretty cool, right? You guys can do this from your own custom Lightning components. And take a look at that force namespace and try out the other navigation events as well. Now let's go back to our deck and talk about component events. So component events, they are useful whenever you guys have like a parent-child component and different children inside your parents, so basically a nested components hierarchy, like our ListView, which has a ListView parent and different children, right, the ListView rows. And that's very useful whenever you need to send or to bubble up information from the child Lightning components on your hierarchy to the parents. So component events, they can actually be handled by the events that fires them, and by any parents on this nested components hierarchy architecture like ours. Let's take a look real quick on how we're using component events in our ListView row. So here, if you guys remember, these rows represent our children Lightning components, right? So inside a ListView row, we have this menu button group, and we have this remove action, right? So our use case from our customer was, OK, you guys need to build an option that we can remove any rows from our ListView row. So this is a perfect scenario where a Lightning component event would make sense, because we need to send a communication. Remember, this button group here lives on the child components level. So we need to send a communication from the child to the parent, because the parent is the one that can remove anything from the HTML DOM, right? So this is basically what we use, and I'm going to show you guys the code, but just to illustrate how this works, the user clicks on remove, and the children get removed. So how do we do that, right? Let's go to our ListView row component. Let's take a look at that button menu group here. So here we have that remove option, the last one, right? So basically, we first handle the browser event handle list menu on the button menu level. This is a Lightning-based component, which we're going to talk next. And then, so once we're inside the handle list menu, click controller action, which is right here. We basically have a switch statement that we're able to see if the user clicked on view, edit, or remove. If they clicked on remove, what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate a bubbling action event. And I'm going to show you guys the markup of this event real quick. But this is a Lightning component event that we're going to use to send information from the child to the parent, right? So let me go back to the child, to the ListView row markup, because I want to show you that on the top here, we register this bubbling action event of type ListView row bubble action event. So this is a custom Lightning event that we created for this purpose. So we register, we're going to fire that. And let me show you the markup for this ListView bubble action event. What's that? Here it is. So basically, this is an Aura event, and the type is component. Again, perfect for this bubble scenario that we have. And we define 3 attributes, right, that we want to communicate from the child to the parent. So the attributes are record ID, the child action, because we want to say, OK, this is a remove action that we're receiving on the parent action, and the index row of that child component. OK? So let's go back to the ListView row controller, where we are about to fire that event. So first, so we instantiate that event in code. We set the parameters with the record ID, with the child action remove, with the index row of this child that is firing this bubbling event. And then we basically fire this component event. And now we know that it's going to bubble up to any parent in our hierarchy. So let's take a look at what happens at the ListView component, which is our parent. So in order to handle this component event, the parent needs to add a handler, basically, to that same bubbling action event. And whenever it receives any of these bubbling events, it's going to execute this handle bubbling action JavaScript action. Let's take a look at what that does. So here it is, handle bubble action. So basically, we use a JavaScript variable to get the parameters of that bubbling event. And then with a switch statement, we look at that action that was sent by the child. So if it is removed, we basically use the JavaScript list.splice to remove the child from our list DOM based on its index. Okay, so that's how the child component disappears from our DOM in our entire Lightning component. So that's an example of component events. So now let's talk about application events. So application events are very useful whenever you guys need to integrate between Lightning components that are not on this nested components hierarchy, meaning child and parent. Maybe they live on the same level. Maybe are different Lightning components that live on the same Lightning page, and you guys need to exchange information between them, right? So application events, they follow a publish-subscriber model, meaning that one Lightning component registers and fires this application event, and only the Lightning components, the other Lightning components that actually subscribe to the same application event will be able to handle it. So if you guys look at the monitor here, component A in yellow on the left is firing that application event, and only components B and D are handling that same event, and that's because they're registering for the same event, but not component C. Component C doesn't know anything about this, but it lives on the same page. So this is an example. Let me show you guys an example in our code here. So if you guys recall, this is a page that we have on our recruitment application called Interviewer Console. So here on the left, we have our ListView loading the interviews that are coming up for me. I'm the hiring manager. And I have two other Lightning components on the same Lightning page, so a Twitter Explorer and a referrals component. So my use case, my request was, OK, so you need to build a Lightning page that whenever the user clicks on a row on the list view, the other Lightning components refresh with contextual data, right? So that's what we use. We use application events that we fire from the list view component to pass information to these other two Lightning components so they refresh with contextual data. So if we click on list Brooks here on our list view, you see that the Twitter Explorer and the referrals component, they refresh with contextual data for lists. If you click back on Rodrigo, same thing happens. So we were thinking, OK, so we know we need to use a Lightning application event for that. But should we build a custom one, or should we try to see if Salesforce already has an event with a structure exactly for that, right? So what we did is we went to the Aura Docs application. And here on the same events area here in our navigator, under LTNG namespace, we found this select as object event. So this is a standard application event that Salesforce makes available that everybody can use for this type of communication. So it looks like the documentation page says that this event sends the record ID when an object was selected in the UI. And it has only one required attribute, which is the record ID, right, that you actually need to populate before you fire the event so other components can receive that. And it has a channel attribute, which is basically you can use to identify the Lightning component who is firing this event. So we said, OK, that's great. So let's use this, right, instead of creating our own custom events. So let's go back to our code. And on our child level, on our list view rows, we added a handler. We register. First, we register. We were going to fire this LTNG select as object event at some point. And then on our table row here, which is actually the HTML element that the user clicks on, we added an onClick. So this is a browser event handler. And then we call this action fire row click events. So let's take a look at what that does. Fire row click events. So basically, inside here, we use JavaScript to grab the selected record ID from the HTML DOM. Okay, so through its data set record. And then we instantiate that LTNG select as object application event. And then we populate those two parameters that we just saw on the documentation page. So record ID and channel. And then we fire that event, right? So remember, only the Lightning components on the page that subscribe to the same event will be able to handle it. So let's take a look at what happens on the Twitter Explorer Lightning component. Here it is. OK, here it is. So here on the top of the markup, in order to register to handle that application event, we basically add a handler to that same LTNG select as object. And then we add inside the action attribute, we just say, OK, whenever we receive that application event, execute this handle application event local controller action, which I'm not going to go into details. In our case here, it makes an API call to the Twitter API and brings back the contextual information for that candidate to show the Twitter information. So this is an event example of how to use an application event. And now let's talk about Lightning-based components. Because like I mentioned, this is pretty exciting. Me as a developer, when the Lightning framework first came out, I had to build all the little pieces of user interface with HTML like from zero. But now Salesforce, with every new release, we're making these basic building blocks with JavaScript, CSS, all baked in for you guys to use, which really helps with development speed, and as they are accessible through code. So think of an avatar, for example. You don't need to create an image tag and style that. So that's Lightning-based components. They are always looking at the latest and greatest version of the Salesforce Lightning design system, which now sits in core. So it's not a static resource anymore. So meaning that by leveraging this, you guys will always be looking and using the latest version of Lightning design system. Another example would be a checkbox label, right, with data validation, CSS style, or a button menu group, for example. And let me show you how to find the basic components that are available for you guys to use now, right? So here, if you guys go to the Lightning Components Developers Guide and you search for base components, you get to this page, which actually shows all the base components that are available to use right now. You notice something there under the Lightning namespace, which means that if you go to Aura Docs and you expand components on the left navbar, you will also be able to see the same base components that are available in your developer org from the Aura Docs application as well. We are using inside our list view this Lightning button menu, which when I click on that, I get a nice documentation page showing how to use it, how to handle the events that it fires, and etc. So let's take a look at our code. So here on the list view row, let's go back to the list view row component. As you guys have seen already, we're using this Lightning button menu. So this is a base component that really helps save a lot of time to create this list view row component. All right, so definitely check out Lightning-based components and which ones you guys can leverage. Now let's talk about Lightning Data Service, which actually, funny enough, it is another Lightning-based component. It's called Force Record Data. It doesn't render any UI, but that basically puts a standard controller, if you're used to Visualforce, inside your Lightning component, which means we're going to take a look at the code real quick, but you guys can gather data from the server, or meaning we're going to talk about this. It's not always from the server, because this has another implied benefit, which is awesome to make your Lightning components performant, which is it has a record cache functionality, which means that it doesn't need to, your components, by leveraging Force Record Data, they don't need to make a trip to the server to gather record information every time they need to refresh. Because this is something that all of Salesforce CRM standard components is using. So if you are on a record page, all you have to do is insert a reference to this Force Record Data. And if any other Lightning components, standard ones or custom ones that handle Force Record Data, makes any change to that record instance, all your components on that page get instantly notified, and they get the change without having to make a single trip to the server. So this is really powerful. Another benefit that is still in draft, the goal is to allow offline support in the future as well, which means that you basically could have a Lightning page with all Lightning components working with record data in cache if you don't have internet connection. And we have a smart sync technology running on the background that actually commits the data to the server if you're losing internet connection, or if there was any change made by any other users, it's notified as well. So this is pretty powerful. I definitely recommend you guys checking this. Let's take a look at how we are using this in our example here. So we have here on our candidate record page, we added this Lightning component here to the top right, which is it renders a chart. So the use case was we needed to create a component that renders a chart that shows the score of this candidate for the different types of interviews that they had. So let me show you guys real quick the code for this chart component to see how we're handling Lightning Data Service inside of it. So basically, we just added Force Record Data. We're tying into the record ID, so our Lightning component uses that Force has record ID interface, so it's aware of the record ID from the record page. And then we specify on these fields attributes the fields that we actually need information from that record on this chart component. Okay, so let's go back here to our example here. So see how powerful this is. Let's see. So the blue one is management interview, which is the score is 40. So if we make a change on a standard field on a record, let me choose technical interview instead. Notice what happens to that chart Lightning component that is subscribing to that record cache, to Lightning Data Service, right? So it refreshes, it redraws automatically. So see how powerful this is, not only for performance, but for user experience as well, right? So this is just an example of what we just showed live. And now let's talk about that technique that I mentioned in the beginning, which is sometimes when you have this parent and child architecture with Lightning components, it's really useful if you need flexibility, if you need to create children with different look and feel and different UI elements, real-time based maybe on configuration data that lives in the Salesforce org that your customers are providing. You guys can use this technique to build those children as opposed to adding the markup inside an RI iteration tag, for example. And then you can play around with the attributes in code. Let me show you an example of how we did that. So how we're using this. So here, remember our ListView? We created the exact same version of our ListView with this technique. So it renders, it looks the same, but let me show you how we did that in code. So dynamic list view. All right, let me just 1 second. Yeah, so basically this is, oh, here it is. OK. So basically on our, we created another version of that same Lightning component, the ListView, that you guys saw with RI iteration. But instead of RI iteration, what we're going to do here on our markup is add this facet, v.body. And from our JavaScript code on our parent, we're going to dynamically create the ListView rows wherever it is we added this v.body facet. OK? Let's take a look at how we do that. So if you go to the helper file, after we get the records from our server, right, to populate our list view, we basically use a.create component. So basically, we're inside a for loop. We're looping through the list of records that are going to populate our list views. So inside that for loop, we use a.create component to create the same list view row child inside our parent, exactly where that facet is in our markup, in our parent's markup. And like I mentioned, the real benefit here is, let's say you have a list view row needs to be read-only to that candidate, but the other one right below it doesn't have to or doesn't need to be read-only. So you can play around in code here with the attributes of your children and gain a lot of flexibility. So that brings us to our session resources. So we're going to share the deck. It has these links to the Trailhead modules that are really tied to our presentation here. We're going to share. You guys are going to be able to click on those links and get directly to those pages, to the component dev guide pages that we showed, as well as to our GitHub. If you guys want to take a look at our list view row and all the other Lightning components that you guys saw here, if you guys want to use the code, feel free to do that as well. I don't think we have much time for Q&A, but I'm happy to stay here and answer any questions you guys may have. Thank you so much.